The glass was too still. Grace Miller noticed it before she noticed the music fading behind the banquet doors. There were 12 glasses on the silver tray in front of her. 12 tall stems arranged in a perfect circle, each filled with the same dark red wine from the same sealed bottle, each catching the candlelight in narrow ribbons of ruby and gold. 11 of them trembled when Grace lifted the tray. One did not. The glass in the center remained perfectly motionless, its surface smooth as black glass, as though the wine inside had forgotten it was liquid. Grace stopped breathing. It was a small thing. Too small for the stewards rushing past her with polished serving knives. Too small for the kitchen boys carrying baskets of hot bread toward the hall. Too small for Clara Bennett, the banquet manager, who stood near the archway snapping orders in a low voice sharp enough to cut through the smell of roasted meat, pine smoke, and expensive perfume. But Grace saw it. She always saw the things people with power did not bother to see. A missing cuff button on a nervous councilman. A smear of ash on a glove that should have been clean. A lady switching place cards with her sister before the seating bell. A guard pretending not to watch the eastern exit. These were not grand secrets. They were not the sort of truths sung about in halls or recorded in council books. They were the small betrayals of the body, the tiny failures people made when they believed no one beneath them had eyes. Grace had built her life on noticing them. She was 25 years old, a white American waitress in a gray service dress and a white apron that had been washed thin at the corners. Her blonde hair was pinned tightly at the back of her neck because Clara said loose hair made servants look careless, and carelessness near powerful wolves was a luxury Grace could not afford. Her shoes were plain black, the left sole softer than the right from years of standing through banquets that lasted long after midnight. Her hands were steady because unsteady hands broke glasses, and broken glasses cost wages. Tonight, the glasses belonged to the king's table. That made them dangerous before anyone poisoned them. Ironwood Banquet Hall had been prepared for 3 days for the arrival of Alpha King Alexander Hayes. The floors had been polished until the dark wood reflected the chandeliers. Black banners edged with silver thread hung between the high windows. Every candle had been cut to the same height. Every knife laid at the same angle. Every servant warned twice and threatened once. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not meet the king's eyes. Do not stand close enough to be remembered. Grace understood those rules. She had survived by them long before Clara put them into words. Still, her gaze returned to the center glass. The wine was wrong. Not visibly. Not to anyone who had not spent years pouring drinks beneath candlelight. But Grace knew how wine should move. She knew the quick red shiver of a young vintage, the slow roll of a heavier one, the way good wine caught the edge of a glass and released it. This wine clung too long to the crystal. When she tilted the tray by the smallest breath, 11 glasses answered. The center glass resisted. A thin line of silver gray clung just beneath its rim, so faint it could have been a trick of light. Grace's stomach tightened. No. The word formed inside her, silent and useless. A memory rose before she could push it down. Her mother's hands wrapped around a white cloth stained gray at the edges, her voice low and careful as she said, "Never touch a cup that turns the cloth dull. Never trust red wine that moves like oil. Never ask powerful men why poison was poured unless you are ready for them to ask why you recognized it." Silverthorn. Grace had not heard the name spoken aloud in 7 years. She looked toward the banquet doors. Beyond them, the music changed. The violins softened. Conversation thinned, then bent around a silence growing larger from the center of the hall. Someone had entered. Not a noble late to dinner. Not a councilman seeking attention. The air itself seemed to prepare for him. Alpha King Alexander Hayes had arrived. Grace looked back at the tray. 12 glasses. 11 trembling. 1 waiting. And the king's glass was the one that did not move. Grace had learned early that silence was not the same thing as safety. Silence only made survival possible. There was a difference, though no one at Ironwood Banquet Hall cared enough to name it. To them, Grace Miller was useful because she was quiet. She carried trays without shaking. She refilled glasses before guests had to ask. She stepped backward when dominant wolves leaned into conversation, moved around chair legs without brushing velvet skirts, and apologized in a voice soft enough to be forgotten the moment it left her mouth. Clara Bennett called that professionalism. Grace called it staying alive. She had been serving noble tables for 6 years, long enough to understand that wealth had its own weather. Anger gathered before it broke. Boredom sharpened when wine ran low. Lies made people touch their throats, their rings, the buttons at their cuffs. Men who planned violence rarely looked at their victims first. They looked at exits. They looked at witnesses. They looked at the hands of servants who might carry something inconvenient into view. So Grace watched hands. She watched the junior steward near the bottles, whose fingers smelled faintly of lemon oil because he had polished the silver too quickly. She watched Clara's tight grip on the seating chart, already bending the corner of the parchment. She watched the kitchen boys pretending not to stare through the crack in the banquet doors, hoping for a glimpse of the Alpha King and fearing they might get one. And she watched the wine. The center glass sat on her tray with unnatural patience. Grace shifted her weight slightly, pretending to adjust the napkin folded over her forearm. The other glasses quivered in response, a delicate red trembling inside crystal bowls. The king's glass did not. The wine clung to itself, thick and dark, holding still beneath the candlelight as if it had been taught obedience by something crueler than gravity. Her mouth went dry. She wanted to set the tray down. She wanted to call for a guard, for Clara, for anyone whose word weighed more than hers. But wanting was useless in rooms built on rank. A waitress did not accuse royal wine of being wrong. A waitress did not say poison in a hall full of wolves unless she was ready for every eye to turn and ask how she knew what poison looked like. Grace knew exactly how. Her mother had kept a sick room behind their old house in Mercy Falls, where poor wolves came when official healers refused them or charged too much to open a door. Grace had grown up washing cups after fevers, boiling cloth after bites, holding lanterns while her mother stitched wounds by hand, because magic cost money and kindness did not. Silverthorn had come late one winter. 3 men first, then a girl younger than Grace. Then her mother, coughing gray into a cloth she tried to hide beneath the basin. The poison did not kill like a blade. It thickened the blood, slowed the heart, made the body feel cold while the skin burned clean and pale. The wine always looked darker. The cup always left a dull ring on white cloth. Grace looked at the napkin over her arm. White, clean, waiting. Beyond the doors, the banquet hall fell into a silence so complete that even the kitchen seemed to bow. Alpha King Alexander Hayes was inside now. Grace had heard his name for years in the way people spoke of locked gates and winter storms. Not loudly, never carelessly, always with the understanding that some forces did not need permission to change the shape of a room. She had never served him before. She had never wanted to. Tonight, his life sat in the center of her tray. Clara's voice cut through the preparation room. Grace. King's table. Now. Grace lifted the tray. The poison glass did not tremble, but her hand almost did. The banquet hall did not fall silent all at once. It adjusted. That was the only word Grace could think of as she stepped through the service arch with the silver tray balanced against her left palm. The room had been loud moments before, filled with layered conversation, glass against glass, low laughter from men who had learned to make confidence sound effortless. Now every sound seemed to pull itself inward, as if the hall had taken one slow breath and decided to hold it. Alpha King Alexander Hayes stood near the entrance. Grace did not look directly at him. She did not need to. Everyone else told her where he was. The Western Alpha, who had been laughing too loudly, stopped with his mouth half open. 2 councilmen near the fire straightened before they seemed to realize they had done it. A young guard at the pillar lowered his chin, not in fear exactly, but in recognition of something stronger than instruction. Even Clara, who believed discipline could solve almost anything, pressed her lips together and went still. Power moved through the room without raising its voice. Grace watched from beneath her lashes as Alexander crossed the hall. He was taller than the men around him, but that was not what made space open before him. It was the way he walked, as if the space had already agreed. Black formal coat, dark hair brushed back from a face made of clean lines and colder patience. A silver clasp held his cloak at one shoulder, shaped like a wolf's head with its teeth closed, not bared. That frightened Grace more than teeth would have. Men who showed anger gave people something to measure. Alexander Hayes gave nothing away. Behind him walked Beta Donovan Pierce. Grace noticed him because he was the only man near the king whose expression looked arranged rather than natural. The others watched the room. Donovan watched reactions. He smiled when he needed to, lowered his head at the correct angle, kept his hands visible in the loose, elegant manner of a man who wanted everyone to know he had nothing to hide. Grace knew better than to trust visible hands. She had seen too many lies carried in rings, cuffs, napkins, glass stems, and the momentary pressure of a thumb against a hidden seam. Donovan's gaze moved once toward the king's table. Not to the chair, not to Alexander, to the place where the center glass would be set. Grace almost missed a step. The wine in the king's glass remained still on the tray, heavier than the others, dark as a sealed wound under candlelight. Her white napkin brushed the rim as she moved between tables, and she saw it then, a faint gray kiss along the cloth, so pale another waitress might have blamed dust. Grace did not. Her mother's voice moved through her memory, quiet and tired. Never trust the cup that marks white fabric dull. She reached the steps of the high table. Clara stood near the lower end, her eyes sharp with warning. Do not spill. Do not speak. Do not embarrass the house. Grace lowered her head. At the center seat, Alexander sat without haste. He did not reach for anything. He simply rested one hand beside the empty place where his glass belonged and looked over the room as if listening to every silence inside it. Donovan stood just behind his right shoulder, waiting. Grace felt the weight of the tray. 12 glasses. 11 honest. 1 patient. She knew then that if she placed that glass before the king exactly as ordered, he would die because everyone in the room trusted the order more than the girl carrying it. Grace stepped closer. Alexander's eyes shifted to her hands. Not her face. Her hands. And for one terrifying second, she understood that the Alpha King was already watching. Grace did not set the glass down. Not yet. Her fingers paused around the stem while the rest of her body continued the motions expected of a waitress at the king's table. A slight bend at the waist. Eyes lowered. Tray angled just enough to offer service without seeming to present herself. The movements were old, practiced, invisible. They had carried her through rooms filled with men who could ruin a servant's life because their soup had cooled. But this was not soup. This was the Alpha King's cup. Alexander Hayes watched her hand with an attention so exact it felt like touch. Grace placed the first glass before the Western Alpha, then the second before a silver-haired councilwoman, then the third beside an empty seat reserved for the Thornridge envoy. Each glass trembled lightly when it left the tray, red rippling against crystal, the normal little shiver of wine settling after movement. The center glass remained still. It weighted near her thumb. Grace could feel its weight through the tray. Not heavier enough to make the silver tilt. Not enough for Clara or the guards or the noble wolves at the table to notice. But enough. The wrongness lived in tiny measurements. The kind poor women learned because mistakes were expensive and no one forgave them twice. She moved closer to Alexander. The smell reached her then. Faint under cedar smoke, candle wax, roasted venison, and the sharp, clean scent of high-ranking wolves gathered too close together. Bitter almond. Cold metal. A sweetness that did not belong in wine. Grace's throat tightened. Silverthorn did not announce itself. It did not stink like rot or burn the nose like cheap poison. It behaved politely. That was part of its cruelty. It entered rich rooms dressed as ceremony, sat in beautiful cups, and waited for powerful men to believe beauty meant safety. Her mother had hated that most. Poison does not need to look ugly, Grace. Remember that. Grace looked at the rim. The gray line was clearer now beneath the candlelight, a thin, dull crescent where the wine had touched the crystal. A normal guest would see reflection. Grace saw residue. The same color that had stained her mother's cloths. The same lifeless ash-gray ring that had spread through wash water the winter Mercy Falls stopped sending its pour to official healers because too many did not come home. Her hand tightened. The napkin over her wrist brushed the poisoned rim again. A second dull mark appeared on the white cloth. Proof. Small, silent, useless proof. Because if she held up the napkin and said the king's glass was poisoned, Clara would deny responsibility before the first gasp finished. Donovan would ask how a waitress recognized Silverthorn. The guards would take the tray from her hands. The poison glass would disappear into someone else's evidence. And Grace Miller would become the easiest explanation in the room. A waitress close to the wine. A poor girl with knowledge she should not have. A nobody placed conveniently beside death. Donovan Pierce shifted behind Alexander's chair. The movement was slight, only the adjustment of one polished shoe against the floor, but Grace felt it travel through the table like a warning. He was waiting for the glass to touch the wood, waiting for the king's hand to close around it, waiting for order to do what murder could not do openly. Grace lowered her eyes farther. Her pulse beat once in her injured memory, in the place where grief had taught her to recognize what others called impossible. She could not accuse. She could not run. She could not ask to be believed. So she did what waitresses had always done to survive powerful rooms. She let everyone think she was only serving. Grace had one chance to speak before the glass reached the table. She knew it the way the body knows the edge of a stair in the dark, not as thought, as danger, as measurement. The poisoned glass rested near her thumb, still and patient, while the Alpha King's hand waited on the table only inches away from the place where it was meant to be set. Grace lowered the tray by a fraction. "Miss Bennet," she said. Clara's eyes snapped toward her. It was not a look. It was a warning given shape. Grace felt it strike harder than any spoken reprimand. A waitress did not interrupt service at the high table. A waitress did not use her manager's name where nobles could hear it. A waitress certainly did not hesitate with royal wine while the Alpha King sat waiting before the entire hall. But Grace forced the next words past the dryness in her throat. "The king's glass." Clara moved before Grace could finish. Her fingers closed around Grace's wrist beneath the hanging edge of the service napkin. Not hard enough to cause a scene. Hard enough to promise one later. Her smile appeared at once, neat and empty, the kind used by women who had learned to correct disasters without letting powerful people know a disaster had happened. "Careful," Clara said lightly, for the table to hear. "The girl is nervous." A small laugh moved from somewhere lower in the hall. Grace felt heat climb her neck. Nervous. That was how they would name it. If she trembled, she was nervous. If she paused, she was nervous. If she saw death in a beautiful glass and tried to stop it, she was a foolish young waitress overwhelmed by the honor of serving a king. Donovan Pierce leaned forward behind Alexander's chair. "Royal wine makes many servants nervous," he said. His voice was pleasant. That made Grace colder. Alexander did not turn toward him. He still washed Grace's hands. Donovan's gaze dropped to the tray, then to the center glass, then to the white napkin marked faintly gray at Grace's wrist. His expression did not change, but Grace saw recognition pass behind his eyes like a door closing. He knew she had noticed. Clara released Grace's wrist, but Donovan's next words held her more tightly. "Best not to delay," he said. "A servant who hesitates over a king's cup invites ugly questions." There it was. Not a threat anyone could accuse him of making. Nothing so crude. Nothing so useful. Just a sentence shaped carefully enough to sound like advice, while placing a blade beneath every option she had left. If she spoke now, she would be the question. How did she know? Why had she touched the glass? Why had the white cloth marked dull beneath her hand? Why had a waitress recognized a poison most healers prayed never to see? Grace looked down at the tray. The poison wine did not move. Her mother had once told her that survival was not always the same as obedience. Sometimes survival meant letting the room believe you had obeyed until the final second, when the truth could no longer be hidden by rank. Grace breathed in, once, slowly. Then she smiled the small, forgettable smile expected of a waitress who had been corrected in public. "Of course," she said. Clara's shoulders relaxed. Donovan's hand eased against the back of Alexander's chair. The room accepted her silence because rooms like this had always expected silence from girls like her. Grace stepped closer to the Alpha King's place. The poisoned glass waited at the center of the tray. A clean glass trembled at the edge, and beneath the cover of lowering her eyes, Grace shifted her grip. Grace shifted her grip, and the world narrowed to the width of her wrist. No one else saw the movement. That was the point. It was not a dramatic gesture, not a stumble, not a gasp, not the kind of mistake that would make guards step forward and nobles turn their heads in irritation. It was only a small adjustment beneath the white service napkin, the kind any waitress might make to keep a heavy tray balanced while leaning over a crowded table. Grace let the clean glass at the outer edge slide half an inch inward. At the same time, she turned the tray. Not fully, only enough. The silver tray caught the candlelight and flashed once, hiding the motion of her fingers. The poisoned glass drifted away from the Alpha King's place. The clean glass came forward, trembling slightly, red wine bright and honest against crystal. Grace lowered it before Alexander Hayes. Her hand did not shake. That surprised her. Fear had filled every part of her body except the place that mattered. Her fingers remained precise. Her wrist stayed soft. Her breath moved evenly through her nose. Years of carrying drinks through crowded rooms had trained her for this without knowing it. Years of being invisible had given her the perfect weapon. Emotion no one respected enough to watch. Except the king. Alexander's eyes followed the glass. Grace felt the exact moment he understood that something had changed. Not the poison. Not yet. But the switch. His gaze moved from the clean glass in front of him to the darker one, now resting beside the empty invoice place. Then to Grace's hand. Then to her face. She did not look up. She could not. If she met his eyes, Donovan would see it. Claire would see it. The whole table might feel the shape of whatever had just passed between a king and a waitress who had no right to communicate with him at all. So Grace kept her head bowed and placed the remaining glasses with the calm discipline of someone doing nothing important. One to the Eastern Elder. One to the empty chair. One to Beta Donovan Pierce. The poisoned glass sat 2 places from Alexander now, untouched, still as black ice. Grace could feel Donovan watching. Not openly. He was too careful for that. His attention moved like a knife hidden under silk, sliding from her fingers to the tray to the glass before the king. She heard the faint pause in his breathing when he saw Alexander's cup tremble. A normal cup. A living cup. Grace stepped back. Service was finished. The hall exhaled into motion again. Conversations resumed in softened tones. Someone laughed too loudly near the lower tables, relieved by nothing they understood. The musicians drew their bows across strings, and the music returned, fragile and golden under the chandeliers. Alexander did not drink. He lifted the glass. Grace's heart struck once, hard enough to hurt. But he only held it beneath the candlelight, turning the stem slowly between 2 fingers. The red wine moved exactly as wine should move. It climbed the crystal wall, then fell back in a thin, shining curve. His eyes shifted toward the poisoned glass. Donovan smiled. "To Alliance," he said, reaching for his own drink. Several nobles raised their glasses at once. The empty invoice chair remained empty, but the councilman beside it, an impatient older wolf with a red face and rings on every finger, leaned across the place setting. "Waste of good wine," he muttered, and took the wrong glass. Grace saw his hand close around the poisoned stem. Alexander saw it too. For 1 second, neither of them moved. Then the councilman lifted the glass toward his mouth. Grace's body acted before rank could stop it. Her hand swept down to the table, caught the small silver dessert spoon beside Alexander's plate, and dropped it into the poisoned wine. The sound was tiny, a soft clink. The reaction was not. The red wine darkened instantly, folding inward on itself until gray-black veins spread from the spoon like smoke trapped beneath glass. The crystal fogged. A bitter scent rose so sharply that the guard wolf nearest the table growled before he could stop himself. Every voice in the banquet hall died. The councilman dropped the glass. It shattered against the table, spilling blackened wine across the white linen. Grace stood frozen beside the king's chair, her hand still hovering over the place where the spoon had been. Alexander Hayes looked at the ruined wine, then at the clean glass before him, then at Grace. This time, she could not look away. And in the silence of the entire hall, the Alpha King understood exactly what the waitress had done. Donovan Pierce moved before anyone else remembered how. Not toward the broken glass. Not toward the blackened wine spreading across the white linen in thin, ugly veins. Toward Grace. That was what told her everything. A guilty man protected evidence. A frightened man protected himself. Donovan did neither first. He turned on the waitress, because in rooms like this, the lowest person was always the easiest place to put a crime. "Seize her," he said. The order cracked through the silence, so sharply that 2 guards stepped forward before they seemed to know they had obeyed. Grace did not run. There was nowhere to go. The high table rose behind her, the banquet hall opened before her, and every eye in Ironwood had fastened to the gray-dressed waitress standing beside the Alpha King's chair with one hand still hovering over the place where a silver spoon had exposed death. Clara Bennett made a small sound near the service steps. Not defense. Fear. Grace understood that too. Fear taught people to step away from burning things, even when the burning thing had just saved a king. She touched the glass, Donovan said, his voice ringing clear now, controlled, furious beneath the polish. She switched it. You all saw her hand move. A murmur broke across the hall. Grace felt it like cold water down her spine. Because he was not entirely lying. She had switched the glass. She had moved silently, deliberately, with skill no innocent waitress was supposed to possess. She had recognized a poison most nobles only knew by rumor. She had acted without permission at the king's table. Every true thing could be turned slightly until it pointed at guilt. Alexander Hayes did not speak. That was the worst part. He stood slowly, the clean glass still untouched beside his hand, and looked at the ruined wine, then at Grace, then at Donovan. His expression gave nothing away. No gratitude, no accusation, no surprise. Only that cold, precise stillness that made the entire room wait for judgment. Grace's throat closed. For one foolish second, she wanted him to say it. She saved me. She wanted the words because the hall was already building another story around her. She could hear it forming in the whispers. How did a waitress know? Why did she switch the cup? Why was she close enough to the wine? A guard caught her arm. His grip was not cruel, but it was firm. Firm enough to remind her that innocence meant very little without rank to hold it upright. Grace looked down at his hand, then at the black wine staining the linen. Her mother had died with gray on her lips, and no one powerful enough to ask why. Grace had promised herself, kneeling beside that narrow sickbed 7 years ago, that if she ever saw Silverthorn again, she would not look away. She had kept that promise, and now it might bury her. Donovan stepped closer, careful not to touch the spilled wine. "My king," he said, bowing his head with perfect respect. This was no accident. She created the danger, then revealed it. A clever servant could buy herself a place near power that way. Grace lifted her eyes. Not to Alexander. To Donovan. For the first time that night, she let him see that she was afraid. Then she let him see that fear had not stopped her. "I did not poison that glass," she said. Her voice was quiet. The hall heard it anyway. Donovan smiled faintly. "Then explain how you knew." There it was. The question with teeth. Grace felt the guard's hand tighten on her arm. Clara looked away. The councilman who had nearly drunk from the glass sat pale and shaking, alive because of her, and still unable to meet her eyes. Alexander finally moved. He did not look at Grace when he spoke. He looked at Donovan. Let her answer. 3 words. Low. Calm. Absolute. The guard released her at once. Grace stood alone beside the king's table, with black poison soaking into white linen, and every powerful wolf in the hall waiting to decide whether a waitress could tell the truth. She drew one breath, then another, and when she spoke, her voice no longer sounded like service. "It was Silverthorn," she said, "and I know it because it killed my mother." The room changed after Grace said mother. Not loudly. Nothing in Ironwood Banquet Hall moved loudly anymore. The words simply landed in the space between accusation and judgment, and for the first time that night, the nobles at the high table looked at Grace as if she had carried something heavier than wine into their presence. Donovan's smile did not disappear. It adjusted. "A convenient tragedy," he said softly. Grace had expected cruelty. She had not expected the old grief to answer it so quickly, rising in her chest with the same sharpness as the bitter scent from the ruined glass. For 7 years she had kept her mother's death folded small inside her, tucked beneath work, silence, rent, hunger, and the daily discipline of not becoming a woman who looked backward too often. But Silverthorn had opened the fold, and now everyone could see what was inside. "My mother's name was Ellen Miller," Grace said. Her voice trembled once on the name, then steadied. She was not a court healer. She did not have a title or a room in any royal infirmary. She had 2 wooden tables behind our house in Mercy Falls, shelves of boiled cloth, bitter roots hanging from the ceiling, and a bell by the back door for people who could not afford to knock at official ones. No one interrupted. Even Donovan waited, though Grace could feel him looking for a place to cut her apart. She treated wolves who came in the dark, Grace continued. Field hands, kitchen boys, stable girls, omegas who were told their pain could wait because someone higher-ranking had already taken the healer's time. She never asked what pack they belonged to before she washed the blood off their skin. Alexander stood very still beside her. Grace did not look at him. If she did, she might remember she was speaking before the Alpha King. She needed to remember only the sickroom, the steam clouding the small windows. Her mother's sleeves rolled to the elbows, the gray cloth hidden too late beneath the basin. Silverthorn came to Mercy Falls one winter. she said. First in a hunter who thought he had been given ordinary wine, then in 2 guards from a border convoy, then in a girl younger than I was, shaking so hard her teeth cracked against the cup my mother held for her. A councilwoman near the end of the table covered her mouth. Grace looked at the shattered glass. The poison makes wine move wrong. It thickens at the bottom. It leaves a dull ring on white cloth. When it touches silver, it turns gray-black before it dyes clear. My mother taught me that because she thought knowing might save me. Her throat tightened. It did not save her. The hall held its breath. She was poisoned through a treatment cloth. Someone brought a patient already marked with silverthorn and paid in coins dusted with it. By the time she understood, it was in her blood. She died 3 days later, and the official report said fever. Donovan laughed once, low and dismissive. A touching story. Still no proof. Alexander's gaze shifted. Search his ring, Grace said. Donovan went still. It was the first honest thing his body had done all night. Grace turned toward him fully. You kept touching it when I stood near the tray. Not the cup. Not the bottle. Your ring. Men who carry powders do that when they want to feel the seal is closed. Donovan's face hardened. Alexander lifted one hand. 2 guards seized Donovan before he could step back. One pulled the heavy black ring from his finger. The other twisted the inner band. A tiny hidden compartment clicked open. Fine gray powder spilled onto the white tablecloth. The same dead color as the stain on Grace's napkin. For 1 second, the entire hall stared. Then Alexander Hayes spoke, quiet enough that everyone leaned closer to fear him. Silverthorn, he said. Donovan looked at Grace then, not as a waitress, not as a servant, not as a girl beneath him. As the one person in the room he should have feared first. The powder looked harmless. That was the first terrible thing about it. A soft gray dust scattered across the white tablecloth from Donovan Pierce's ring, finer than ash, quieter than smoke, small enough to hide beneath a fingernail or along the inner rim of a glass. No blade, no shout, no blood on the floor, only powder. And still, every wolf in Ironwood Banquet Hall understood that they were looking at murder. Donovan did not move. The 2 guards held him by the arms, but for one breath he did not seem captured. He seemed offended, as if the crime was not the poison, not the dead women, not the king's glass, but the fact that a waitress had forced the room to see what he had hidden. Then his control broke. She touched the tray, he snapped. She switched the glass. She knew the poison because she brought it here. The words came fast now, too fast for innocence. Grace heard the difference at once. Donovan was no longer shaping the room. He was throwing whatever he could into it, and hoping fear would catch. No one reached for Grace this time. That was how she knew something had changed. The guards remained where they were. Clara Bennett stood frozen at the service steps, one hand pressed to her mouth. The councilman who had nearly drunk the poisoned wine pushed his chair back with shaking fingers and stared at Grace, as if gratitude and shame were fighting behind his eyes. Alexander Hayes looked at Donovan, not with surprise, not even with anger, with the kind of stillness that made anger look childish. Who poured the king's glass? He asked. Donovan's mouth closed. Alexander turned slightly. Lock the doors. The command moved through the hall like iron falling into place. Guards sealed the main entrance, then the side arches, then the service passage. The music had stopped entirely now. No one pretended this was still a banquet. It was a court of judgment. A young wine steward was dragged forward from behind the service corridor less than 2 minutes later. His face was pale, his collar damp with sweat, and one sleeve had been torn in his attempt to run. When he saw Donovan in chains, his knees failed before anyone touched him. I was told it would only weaken him. The steward gasped. I swear, I did not know it would kill him. Grace closed her eyes once. Lies always asked to be believed after they failed. Alexander's voice remained low. Who told you? The steward looked at Donovan. That was enough. Donovan lunged, but the guards forced him down against the table so hard the silverware jumped. The gray powder scattered wider, staining the linen like dead frost. Alexander stepped around the table and stopped before Grace. The entire hall watched him do it. Grace suddenly remembered her hands. One still held the stained napkin. The other hung at her side, fingers curled inward as if she were still carrying a tray. She wanted to fold them properly, to lower her head, to disappear into the useful posture that had kept her alive for years. Alexander did not allow it. She switched my glass, he said. A murmur moved through the room. Grace looked at him. His eyes were on the nobles, the elders, the guards, the servants half hidden near the doors. She switched my glass because she knew what all of you were too proud to see. No one spoke. The waitress you accused is the reason your king is alive. The words struck harder than any shout could have. Grace felt them move through the hall, changing the shape of every stare that touched her. Suspicion became disbelief. Disbelief became recognition. Recognition became something almost unbearable. Respect. Alexander held out his hand. Grace stared at it. A king's hand was not offered to waitresses in public halls. Not after service. Not after accusation. Not while poison still stained the table between nobles and servants alike. But his hand remained there. Steady. Waiting. Grace placed her stained fingers in his palm. Alexander lifted her hand where everyone could see the gray mark on the napkin and the red line where the glass stem had pressed into her skin. From this moment, he said, no one in my kingdom calls Grace Miller just a waitress again. Clara lowered her eyes. The guards bowed their heads. Donovan Pierce was dragged backward in chains, still shouting words no one cared enough to believe. Grace stood beside the Alpha King in the ruined silence of the banquet hall, with spilled silverthorn drying black on the tablecloth and the clean glass still untouched before his chair. She had not saved him because she was chosen. She had not saved him because she was powerful. She had watched what others ignored. She had moved when speaking would have killed her. And for the first time in her life, the room did not look through her. It looked at her. The clean glass remained on the table long after no one wanted to look at it. That was the thing Grace remembered later. Not Donovan's shouting as the guards dragged him through the sealed doors. Not Clara Bennett's silence at the service steps. Not even the way Alpha King Alexander Hayes had held her hand before the entire hall and made her name sound heavier than accusation. The glass. Untouched. Ordinary. Red wine trembling softly inside it each time someone moved near the table. A life that had continued because she had shifted her wrist half an inch. Grace stood beside Alexander while the banquet hall rearranged itself around the truth. Guards collected the broken crystal in silver-lined evidence bowls. A healer sealed the gray powder from Donovan's ring inside a dark vial. The young wine steward knelt near the lower steps, shaking so hard his confession came in pieces. Donovan had paid him. Donovan had given him the powder. Donovan had told him the king would only be weakened before the alliance vote. Grace listened without moving. The words should have satisfied something inside her. They did not. Confession did not return the years Silverthorn had taken from her mother. It did not undo the mornings Grace had woken before dawn because Rent did not care about grief. It did not make the room easier to stand in while nobles who had doubted her now avoided her eyes. Respect, she was learning, could be as heavy as suspicion. Alexander noticed before anyone else. Enough, he said. The hall stilled again. Grace turned toward him, not because she meant to, but because his voice had become the only steady thing in the ruined room. She needs air. No one argued. That, too, felt strange. A guard opened the side door leading to the winter balcony. Cold night air spilled into the hall, carrying the scent of wet stone, pine, and distant rain. Grace stepped through before she could think better of it. Her legs held until she reached the balcony rail. Then her hands began to shake. Not a little. Violently. She gripped the black iron rail, but the shaking only moved into her shoulders. She hated it. Hated that her body had waited until after the danger to betray her. Hated that she had stood before kings and poison and accusation, only to nearly break apart under the clean open sky. Alexander did not touch her. He stood a careful distance away. That was the first thing that made her breathe easier. You should sit, he said. I have work to finish. The answer left her mouth automatically. A servant's answer. A woman's answer after years of being useful, because usefulness kept hunger away. Alexander looked back through the open door, where blackened wine still stained the king's table. Your work saved my life. Grace swallowed. The cold air burned behind her eyes. I only moved a glass. No, he said. You made a choice everyone else was too protected to understand. She looked at him then. He was not softened by gratitude. Not in the way storybook kings became gentle after being rescued. He still looked like a man built from discipline, command, and dangerous patience. But his attention no longer passed over her as part of the room. It stayed. You knew Silverthorn before tonight, he said. Grace's fingers tightened on the rail. Beyond the balcony, Rain began to fall over ironwood, thin and silver beneath the moon. My mother did, Grace said. And it killed her because men with power needed a poor healer to stay quiet. Alexander's expression changed. Not pity, recognition. Then anger, controlled so tightly it almost looked like calm. What was her name? Grace looked back at the hall, at the ruined table, at the glass she had saved him from. Ellen Miller, she said. Alexander repeated it once, low and exact, as if placing the name somewhere it could not be erased again. The name changed the balcony. Ellen Miller. It had been only 2 words when Grace spoke it, small against the rain and the dark stone and the ruined banquet hall behind them. But when Alexander Hayes repeated it, the name seemed to gain weight. Not decoration, not pity. Weight. The kind a name should have had before it was pressed into a village grave with no inquiry, no witness, and no one powerful enough to ask why a healer had died coughing gray into a cloth. Grace looked away first. She did not want him to see what the sound had done to her. For 7 years, her mother's name had belonged to small rooms, to the back of a cottage that still smelled of boiled roots in Grace's memory, to Mercy Falls women who crossed themselves when they mentioned her, to unpaid debts forgiven quietly because Ellen Miller had once wrapped a fevered child in warm towels and stayed awake until dawn. It did not belong in the mouth of a king, and yet there it was, not erased, not laughed at, remembered by someone who had only just learned it. Behind them, the banquet hall remained in motion. Guards spoke in clipped voices. Evidence bowls clinked. The young wine steward wept somewhere near the doors. Clara Bennett was explaining something too quickly to a councilwoman who had stopped believing every word before the sentence ended. Grace heard it all, as if through water. Alexander did not turn back toward the hall. Mercy Falls, he said. Grace's hands tightened on the balcony rail. Yes. There was an outbreak recorded there 7 years ago. She went still. Not because she was surprised he knew. Kings knew many things. That was what people told themselves. But there was a difference between a king knowing border losses, tribute figures, names of traitors, and a king remembering a poor settlement whose dead had been filed away under fever because fever was easier than scandal. It was not an outbreak, Grace said. No, Alexander replied. It was not. The rain thickened, tapping softly against the stone ledge. Grace felt cold damp settle along the sleeves of her gray service dress, but she did not move inside. Warmth would have made the moment too gentle, and there was nothing gentle about what sat between them now. My mother sent 3 letters, she said. To the district healer, to the Thornridge magistrate, to someone in the Royal Supply Office. I copied the last one because her hands were shaking too badly. Alexander's jaw tightened. What did she write? Grace closed her eyes. The words came back with cruel clarity, not because she wanted them to, but because grief preserved useless things perfectly. That the poison was moving through wine shipments. That the men who came to her sick room all had gray stains at the mouth and silver burns beneath their nails. That someone was testing silverthorn on people no one would count. The silence after that was not empty. It was gathering teeth. Alexander looked through the open balcony doors toward Donovan Pierce, who had been forced to his knees near the high table while a guard searched the lining of his coat. Donovan served on the Royal Supply Commission 7 years ago, he said. Grace opened her eyes. The rain blurred the torchlight beyond the courtyard, turning the world gold and black. For a moment, she could not speak. The thought was too large, too precise, too cruel. Her mother had written to a system that had already contained the man who needed her silent. She never had a chance, Grace said. Alexander's voice went colder. No, but he does not get to hide behind her silence anymore. Grace looked at him then. He was still the Alpha King, still controlled, still dangerous in the way winter was dangerous when it stopped pretending to be weather and became judgment. But something in him had shifted toward her pain without trying to own it. That mattered, more than comfort would have. What happens now? She asked. Alexander turned fully toward the hall. Now, he said, we find every letter your mother sent. Grace's breath caught. And after that, his eyes returned to hers. After that, Grace Miller, the kingdom hears her name from somewhere louder than a sick room. By midnight, Ironwood Banquet Hall no longer looked like a place built for celebration. The candles had burned low in their silver holders. The long tables stood half cleared, stripped of fruit bowls, folded napkins, and the illusion that fine manners could protect anyone from rot. The white cloth at the king's table had been removed entirely, carried away in a sealed evidence chest because silverthorn had soaked too deeply into the weave to be trusted near skin. Grace sat in a small records chamber behind the eastern gallery, still wearing her gray service dress. No one had told her to change. No one had told her to return to the kitchens either. That absence of command unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. For 6 years, every hour of her working life had belonged to someone else's voice. Carry this. Pour that. Stand there. Disappear now. Without orders, her body did not feel free. It felt misplaced. Alexander stood across from her at a narrow table covered in opened files. He had removed his formal cloak, but not the black coat beneath it. Candlelight cut along the hard line of his face as he read through reports brought from the Royal Archive under guard. He did not rush. That was what made the room feel dangerous. Other men searched frantically when they feared what they might find. Alexander searched like a man already certain the truth was there and patient enough to make it show itself. A guard entered with another bundle of letters tied in faded blue cord. From the Thornridge Magistrate's storage, Your Majesty. Grace's hands went cold. Blue cord. Her mother had used blue thread to tie all correspondence because it was cheaper than wax, and because, Ellen Miller had once said, poor women learned to make records out of whatever they could afford. Alexander looked at Grace before touching the bundle. May I? The question nearly undid her. No one had asked permission before handling what was left of her mother. Not the district men who searched the sick room after Ellen died. Not the landlord who cleared the cottage. Not the official healer who took the jars and labeled them contaminated before Grace could ask which had belonged to family and which to work. Grace nodded once. Alexander untied the cord. The first letter unfolded with a dry whisper. Grace recognized her own handwriting before she recognized the words. Her chest tightened so sharply she had to place one hand against the edge of the table. Alexander read silently at first. Then his eyes stopped. There are shipments marked with the Hayes seal, he said. Grace looked up. My seal was used on the wine route 7 years ago, before I took the throne. Who controlled them then? Alexander's face hardened. The Supply Commission. Donovan was deputy chair. The door opened again. This time, 2 guards dragged in the young wine steward from the banquet hall. His face was gray with exhaustion, and fear had hollowed him into someone much younger than he had looked beside the wine barrels. Alexander did not raise his voice. Tell her, he said. The steward looked at Grace, then at the floor. Donovan said the powder came from old stock, he whispered. He said it had been tested before. In Mercy Falls. He said no one important had noticed then, so no one would notice now. The room disappeared around Grace. For a moment, there was only her mother's sick room. The dull gray cloth. The letters. The waiting. The silence that followed every unanswered plea. Then Alexander's hand came down on the table. Not loudly. Firmly enough to bring her back. Write his statement, he ordered. The guard moved at once. Grace looked at the blue cord lying beside the opened letters. Her mother had not failed to warn them. The kingdom had failed to listen. Alexander turned to her, and in his eyes Grace saw something colder than pity and more useful than sorrow. At dawn, he said, Donovan answers for both poisons. Grace swallowed. The one in your glass. His gaze held hers. And the one he poured into your mother's life. Dawn entered Ironwood Banquet Hall like a witness. Not warm. Not golden. Pale light slipped through the high windows and touched the stripped tables, the sealed evidence chests, the empty wine stands, the places where celebration had been removed piece by piece until only truth remained. The hall that had glittered beneath chandeliers hours ago now looked older, colder, and less willing to lie. Grace Miller stood beside the king's table with her mother's letters in her hands. They had offered her a chair. She had not taken it. Some part of her still believed sitting before elders, guards, councilmen, and Alpha King Alexander Hayes would be mistaken for arrogance. Another part, the part that had watched wine turn black around a silver spoon, knew that standing was not the same as serving. Not anymore. Donovan Pierce was brought in through the side doors in iron restraints. He looked at Grace first. That was his final mistake. Not at Alexander. Not at the council. Not at the guards who held his arms. At Grace. As though the true offense was still her survival. As though a waitress had no right to remain standing after he had pointed power at her and called it guilt. Grace held his stare. Her hands trembled around the letters. but she did not lower them. Alexander noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. But he did not step in front of her. He did not take the letters away. He stood at her side and let the room understand that protection did not mean hiding her from the truth. She had earned the right to speak. The young wine steward was called first. His confession came broken but clear. Donovan had given him the powder. Donovan had promised the king would weaken during the alliance vote. Donovan had said the poison had been tested before in Mercy Falls, where no one important had noticed. The words moved through the hall like frost. Then Alexander opened the blue cord letters. He read Ellen Miller's warnings aloud. Not quickly, not as evidence to be disposed of. He gave each sentence weight. Wine shipments marked with royal seals. Gray stains on treatment cloths. Silver burns under the nails. Poor wolves dying after drinking from convoy barrels. A healer begging someone, anyone, to believe that poison was being tested on people too low-ranked to be counted. Grace kept her eyes forward. If she looked down, she would see her mother's handwriting. If she saw the handwriting, she might break. Donovan laughed once when Alexander finished. You would condemn me over village letters and a frightened servant's story? Alexander closed the final page. No, he said. I condemn you because you used rank as cover for murder, and because you forgot that servants carry the evidence powerful men leave behind. The hall went silent. Alexander turned to Grace. Ellen Miller's name will be entered into the royal record as the first witness against the Silverthorn network. Her report will be restored. Her death will be investigated as murder. Grace's breath caught. 7 years of silence shifted inside her. Not healed. Named. Donovan lunged against the guards then, but no one flinched. His power had ended the moment the room stopped needing his version of the story. Alexander's voice cut through him. Take him. Iron chains dragged across the floor as Donovan was pulled away. This time, the sound did not follow Grace like fear. It sounded like a door closing. When the hall emptied, only the clean glass remained on the king's table, untouched from the night before. Alexander picked it up, studied the trembling red wine, then set it before Grace. You saw what none of us saw, he said. Grace looked at the glass, then at him. I was trained to notice what people leave for servants to clean. His eyes held hers, steady and unreadable, but not distant. Then my kingdom has been looking in the wrong direction. Outside, the rain had stopped. Grace stood in the pale morning light with her mother's letters against her chest, no longer invisible, no longer only the waitress who switched a glass. She had saved a king. She had named the poison. And at last, the world that had ignored Ellen Miller was forced to listen to her daughter.